Nia accidentally steals from the Korean Mafia. Now the psychotic underboss demands her as his bride. The ring hit the mahogany desk like a gunshot. Nia flinched, pressing her spine flat against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse. "Put it on," Taejin commanded, his voice a low, demonic rumble. She stared at the heavy platinum band. It was a flawless, cold, ruthless promise. It was also the only thing standing between her and a gruesome death. Just hours ago, a simple courier mix-up had left Nia holding a decrypted Mafia ledger and millions in untraceable diamonds. She was supposed to deliver legal documents. Instead, she walked out of a luxury hotel carrying the financial lifeblood of South Korea's most lethal underworld syndicate. Now, she was a hunted target. Rival gangs were currently scouring the streets below, waiting for her to step outside so they could cut her to pieces. They had seen her face. They knew what she carried. Furthermore, if the bloodthirsty boss of Taejin's own organization found out she had walked out with their financial network, he would torture her father before killing her. She had absolutely no way out. Her only shield to survive the night was the ruthless, blood-soaked monster standing in front of her. Taejin, the notoriously psychotic underboss of Seoul's largest mafia, didn't save her out of pity. Pity was a foreign concept to him. He saved her because of what happened an hour ago. In the blood-soaked nightclub, when she had been cornered in the crossfire, Nia hadn't cowered. While hardened killers dove for cover, she had stood her ground. Instead, she had held a bottle of industrial bleach over his precious, encrypted ledger, threatening to destroy billions of dollars of underworld capital to save herself. She had looked the devil in the eye and dared him to pull the trigger. That single act of terrifying defiance had snapped something dark within his twisted mind. In a world where everyone bowed to him, this desperate courier had fought back. It was an intoxication he could not let go of. "I can give you the briefcase back," Nia pleaded, her voice cracking. "Just take it. Tell your boss you found it. He never has to know I existed." "My boss doesn't believe in coincidences," Taejin replied, his thumb grazing her jawline. "He believes in loose ends. And he burns them. He will tear this city apart until he finds the woman who touched his ledger. You cannot hide from him, Nia. You cannot outrun him." "So I'm supposed to just trade one death sentence for another?" she hissed, shoving against his solid, immovable chest. "You're a mobster. You kill people." "I am," Taejin agreed seamlessly. "Which is exactly why you need me. To the underworld, you won't be a thief, you will be my bride." His tone shifted back to cold, lethal strategy. "Harming you becomes an unforgivable act of war against me personally. And no one wants to go to war with me." Nia stared at the diamond glittering on the wood, her mind spinning wildly out of control. A fake marriage to a psychotic underboss. It was insane. It was a nightmare. "No," Nia breathed, shaking her head as she backed away toward the heavy, steel-reinforced door. "I won't do it. I won't tie my life to a murderer. I'll take my chances out there." Taejin didn't step forward. He didn't chase her, nor did his expression soften into a plea. The ruthless underboss of Seoul did not beg. His dark eyes went completely flat, the terrifying, stoic mask slamming back into place. "As you wish," Taejin said seamlessly, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He didn't try to convince her. He simply turned his broad back to her, adjusting his cuffs with chilling indifference. "The elevator is unlocked. The rival gangs are waiting in the lobby. My boss's plane lands in 3 hours. Enjoy your chances, Nia." He began walking toward the private quarters, entirely willing to let her walk out to her slaughter. Nia froze. Her hand hovered over the heavy steel door handle. The silence in the penthouse was deafening, broken only by the distant, eerie wail of police sirens echoing from the streets below. She looked at the door. If she opened it, she was dead. The men who had torn her uniform and shot at her in the club would cut her to pieces the second she stepped onto the pavement. And if they didn't get her, the boss would find her father. He would die screaming because of her mistake. She looked back at the desk. The diamond glittered under the dim neon lights, a heavy, freezing anchor. It wasn't a choice between freedom and captivity. It was a choice between a gruesome, guaranteed death or surrendering to the devil himself. She thought of her father's face. She thought of her own desperate will to live. Wait, her voice cracked, echoing in the cavernous room. Taejin stopped, but he didn't turn around. Nia slowly pulled her hand away from the door handle. Her chest heaving, she walked back to the mahogany desk. Her hands trembled violently as she picked up the cold platinum band. The sheer weight of it was staggering. She didn't wait for him to do it. With tears stinging her eyes and her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, Nia slid the ring onto her own finger. A flawless fit. Taejin slowly turned around. His eyes dropped to her left hand, a dark, burning obsession reigniting in his pitch-black gaze. He had given her the illusion of a choice, and she had chosen him. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his imposing frame once again pinning her in place. "We are getting married tonight," he announced, reaching out to grasp her trembling hand. He pulled it up to his lips, pressing a fiercely possessive kiss directly over the diamond she had just accepted. "The entire underworld will attend. You will smile. You will hold my arm and play the part of a woman madly in love, or we both die before sunrise." He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Do you understand me, my wife?" The heavy steel doors of the penthouse burst open, immediately shattering the intimate, suffocating tension between them. A dozen men in immaculate black suits flooded into the room, their expressions hardened and completely devoid of question as they saw Nia standing there, trembling, with their underboss's platinum ring glittering on her finger. Taejin didn't even flinch. He didn't step away from her. Instead, his large, warm hand slid down from her cheek to rest heavily on the small of her back, a physical brand of ownership that sent a jolt of raw electricity straight down her spine. "Sir, the perimeter is secured, but the White Tigers are mobilizing in the lower districts," his lead enforcer, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, reported sharply, bowing at a perfect 90-degree angle. "They know she is up here. And we just received word from Incheon Airport. The boss's private jet caught a favorable tailwind. He lands in exactly 2 hours. 2 hours. Nia's stomach violently dropped to the floor. The air in her lungs evaporated. She looked up at Taejin, expecting to see a crack in his terrifying composure, but the underboss merely tilted his head, his dark eyes flashing with a lethal, calculated brilliance. "Move the timeline up," Taejin commanded, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "Lock down the Grand Hyatt. The entire ballroom. I want every single capo, lieutenant, and underboss in the city in that room within the hour. If they refuse the invitation, consider it an act of treason and burn their businesses to the ground." "And the bride, sir?" the enforcer asked, his eyes darting to Nia for a fraction of a second before snapping respectfully back to the floor. "Send in the tailors," Taejin replied seamlessly. "She needs to look like a queen." The next 60 minutes were a chaotic, terrifying fever dream. Nia was swept into the master bedroom, a massive, opulent space of dark wood and velvet, where a team of terrified, silent women measured, pinned, and dressed her in a breathtaking, custom-fitted black silk gown. It wasn't traditional white. In the criminal underworld, white meant surrender. Black meant power. The silk clung to her curves like a second skin, the sweetheart neckline framing her collarbones while a dangerous, thigh-high slit allowed her to run if necessary. They swept her dark, damp curls up into an elegant, complex updo, pinning a heavy, diamond-encrusted veil to her crown. When the stylist stepped back, Nia stared at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Gone was the desperate, exhausted courier drowning in debt. In her place stood a striking, untouchable Mafia bride, dripping in millions of dollars of blood diamonds. But beneath the silk and the jewels, her hands were still shaking violently. The heavy bedroom door clicked shut. The stylists had vanished. Taejin stood in the doorway, completely alone. He had changed into a fresh, bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that made his broad shoulders look even more intimidating. He stared at her, his pitch-black eyes slowly dragging from the hem of her gown up to the heavy diamond veil framing her face. The look in his eyes wasn't just appreciation. It was a dark, starving obsession that made the air in the room grow incredibly thick. He walked toward her, his footsteps completely silent on the plush rug. "You are terrified," he stated softly, stopping mere inches behind her. Nia watched him in the mirror. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame, completely engulfing her in his heavy, intoxicating scent of sandalwood and danger. "I am about to walk into a room filled with murderers and pretend I am in love with the most dangerous one of them all," she whispered, her voice cracking. "If I make one mistake, if your boss sees right through this, my father dies." Taejin's jaw tightened. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently gripping her bare shoulders. The contrast of his rough, calloused palms against her soft skin sent a confusing, fiery shiver coursing through her veins. He didn't offer empty comforts. He didn't tell her it would be fine. "You will not make a mistake," Taejin said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that echoed directly into her ear. "Because you are not going to pretend, Nia." She turned around, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs as she looked up into his intense gaze. "What do you mean?" "I mean that survival requires absolute conviction," he explained, stepping even closer, forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "When we walk into that ballroom, the men sitting at those tables will be looking for a single drop of blood in the water. They will be looking for fear. If they think I forced you, if they think you are a hostage or a pawn, they will use you against me. They will try to break you to get to my ledger." He raised his hand, his thumb gently brushing against her lower lip. Nia gasped softly at the touch, her pulse roaring in her ears. "But if you look at me the way you looked at me in the nightclub, with absolute, terrifying fire," Taejin continued, his voice dropping to a seductive, lethal whisper. "If you hold my hand like I am the only gravity keeping you on this earth, they will bow to you. You cannot just act like my wife, Nia. For the next 24 hours, you have to completely believe that you are mine." I don't know how to do that," she stammered, completely overwhelmed by the sheer, magnetic pull of his presence. "You let me lead," he commanded gently, dropping his hand to encircle her narrow waist, pulling her flush against his solid chest. The sudden, intimate proximity made her breath hitch violently. "When I touch you, do not flinch. When I speak to you, look only at me. And when the boss arrives and asks you why a civilian courier is suddenly wearing his underboss's ring, you tell him the truth." Nia frowned in confusion, her hands instinctively resting flat against his lapels to steady herself. "The truth? Tell him you came to steal the ledger," Taejin said, a dark, brilliant smirk playing on his lips. "Tell him you are a thief and you were so incredibly beautiful, so dangerously fearless, that I decided to keep the thief instead of returning the gold." Before she could fully process the sheer, unadulterated madness of his plan, a sharp, urgent knock rapped against the bedroom door. "Sir," the enforcer's muffled voice called out. "The motorcade is ready. The boss's plane just touched down on the tarmac. We are out of time." Taejin's smirk vanished, immediately replaced by the cold, ruthless mask of the underworld executive. He released her waist, instantly leaving Nia feeling strangely, terrifyingly cold. He offered her his arm. "It is time to go to war, my love," he said seamlessly. Nia took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked at the heavy platinum band on her finger, the chains that now bound her to this monster. She didn't have a choice. She slipped her arm through his, clinging to him as if he were a life raft in a hurricane. They descended to the underground garage, stepping into the back of a heavily armored, black Maybach. The ride through the neon-lit streets of Seoul was a blur of police sirens, rain, and suffocating tension. A fleet of 6 identical SUVs flanked them, carrying heavily armed mercenaries. Nia sat rigidly in the plush leather seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but Taejin reached over, firmly taking her hand in his. His thumb soothingly stroked her knuckles, a silent, anchoring promise in the dark cabin. The motorcade pulled up to the grand entrance of the Grand Hyatt. The usually bustling luxury hotel was entirely, ominously empty of civilians. Instead, the perimeter was locked down by hundreds of men in black suits, standing in the pouring rain with assault rifles hidden beneath their coats. Taejin stepped out first, opening an umbrella to shield her from the storm. As Nia stepped out of the Maybach, the entire army of men bowed in perfect, terrifying unison. "Underboss." "Madam," they chanted loudly, the sound echoing like thunder in the night. Nia's breath caught in her throat. The sheer scale of his power was paralyzing. She tightened her grip on his arm. Taejin looked down at her, his dark eyes anchoring her rapidly spiraling panic. "Chin up, Nia," he murmured against her ear as they walked up the marble steps toward the massive, golden doors of the ballroom. "The wolves are waiting." The heavy doors swung open, revealing a cavernous, opulent ballroom dripping in crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of the most dangerous, bloodthirsty criminals in Asia were seated at round tables, the air thick with cigar smoke and deadly anticipation. The moment Taejin stepped over the threshold with Nia on his arm, the room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. Every single pair of eyes locked onto the black woman in the silk gown wearing their underboss's ring. And sitting at the very head of the room, on a velvet throne surrounded by heavily armed guards, was an older, terrifyingly calm man sipping whiskey. The boss had arrived early. He slowly lowered his crystal glass, his cold, dead eyes locking directly onto Nia with a gaze that promised absolute destruction. Well, the boss's voice echoed through the silent ballroom, a soft, venomous drawl that made the hair on the back of Nia's neck stand up. "It seems my favorite underboss has been keeping secrets. Bring her to me, Taejin. Let me see what you have traded my empire for." The distance from the grand golden doors to the velvet throne at the head of the ballroom felt like a march to the executioner's block. The silence in the cavernous room was so absolute, so heavy with lethal anticipation, that Nia could hear the soft, terrifying rustle of her own silk gown brushing against the marble floor. Hundreds of hardened killers, capos, and lieutenants watched her every step. Their eyes were dark, calculating, and entirely merciless, stripping away her defenses piece by piece. They were wolves, just as Taejin had warned, waiting for a single drop of fear to spill into the water. Nia's heart hammered a frantic, bruising rhythm against her ribs, but she remembered the underboss's command. "You let me lead. When I touch you, do not flinch." She tightened her grip on Taejin's arm. Beneath the bespoke midnight blue fabric of his tuxedo, his muscles were coiled like steel cables, ready to snap at a moment's notice. He didn't rush. He walked with a slow, predatory arrogance that commanded the very oxygen in the room. Every time a capo leaned too far forward in their chair, every time a hand drifted too close to the inside of a jacket, Taejin's pitch-black eyes would snap in their direction, pinning them to their seats with a silent, paralyzing threat. He was a walking monument of violence, and in this terrifying underworld, he was entirely hers. They finally stopped at the foot of the raised dais. The boss sat casually on his velvet throne, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. Up close, the patriarch of South Korea's most lethal syndicate looked deceptively ordinary. He had thinning gray hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and wore a simple, immaculately pressed suit. But his eyes, hollow, dead, and devoid of any human empathy, betrayed the absolute monster lurking underneath. "Taejin," the boss said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried flawlessly across the dead-silent ballroom. "You called an emergency summit. You locked down my hotel. You pulled my capos from their districts, leaving our borders exposed to the white tigers. And you did all of this, to parade a woman in front of me. I did this to introduce my bride, Taejin replied seamlessly. His voice was a low, echoing rumble that vibrated with absolute, unwavering authority. He did not bow. He did not lower his eyes. He stood tall, his broad shoulders shielding half of Nia's body from the boss's piercing gaze. And to formally declare that she now carries my name, and by extension, the absolute protection of this syndicate. A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the hundreds of men seated at the tables behind them. The boss raised a single finger, and the room instantly fell back into a suffocating, deathly silence. The boss slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His dead eyes dragged away from his underboss and locked directly onto Nia. The sheer, crushing weight of his attention made her lungs seize. "Your bride," the boss repeated, the words dripping with a toxic, condescending amusement. He set his whiskey glass down on the small table beside him with a sharp click. "A black woman. A civilian. Someone who does not bleed our blood, who does not speak our oaths, and who has no family of standing to offer us an alliance. Tell me, Taejin, how exactly does a girl like this end up wearing millions of dollars of my diamonds on her finger?" "She is my choice," Taejin answered coldly, his jaw tightening as he subtly shifted his weight, preparing for an attack. "That is the only explanation you require." "I decide what I require, boy," the boss snapped, a sudden, terrifying flash of anger breaking his calm facade. The guards flanking the throne instantly rested their hands on the grips of their holstered weapons. "You are my underboss. You do not breathe without my permission, let alone marry. Step aside. I want to look at the creature who has made my best strategist lose his mind." Taejin didn't move an inch. His hand instinctively drifted toward the inside of his tailored jacket. "Do not speak to her like that." "It's all right," Nia whispered, her voice trembling just slightly before she forced it steady. She remembered the fierce, burning obsession in Taejin's eyes back in the penthouse. "If you look at me the way you looked at me in the nightclub, with absolute, terrifying fire, they will bow to you." She could not hide behind him. If she wanted to survive this night, if she wanted to save her father from this monster sitting on the throne, she had to become the queen Taejin had dressed her to be. Nia gently placed her hand flat against Taejin's chest, a silent, anchoring gesture that made the underboss freeze. She stepped out from behind his massive, protective frame, the heavy silk of her black gown pooling beautifully around her heels. She stood at the base of the dais, lifting her chin and locking eyes directly with the most dangerous man in Asia. "You want to know how I ended up with his ring?" Nia asked, her voice ringing out clear and steady in the silent ballroom. The boss tilted his head, genuinely surprised by her sheer audacity. Nobody spoke to him directly. Even his highest-ranking captains kept their eyes glued to the floor in his presence. "I do," he purred, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Enlighten me, little girl." "I didn't meet him at a gala. I didn't get introduced to him through an alliance," Nia said, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm in her ears as she recited the insane narrative Taejin had given her, but adding her own desperate fire to the delivery. "I walked into his territory to steal from him." A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the ballroom. The sound of a dozen safeties clicking off their weapons cut through the air. Taejin's lead enforcer, standing at the edge of the dais, immediately raised his hand, signaling the loyalists in the room to stand by. The boss's cruel smile vanished entirely. "You came to steal from my syndicate?" "I came to take exactly what I wanted," Nia lied flawlessly, her eyes blazing as she channeled every ounce of her terror into pure, unadulterated defiance. She slowly turned her head, looking back at Taejin. The underboss was staring at her, his dark eyes completely consumed by a dark, ravenous pride. But when he caught me, when he cornered me, he decided that instead of taking my life, he would take my freedom. He decided to keep the thief instead of returning the gold. Nia turned back to the boss, her chin held high, the heavy diamond veil catching the light of the chandeliers. "I am not a hostage. I am not a pawn. I am the woman who looked the devil in the eye and took his heart instead of his money. And if you think I am afraid of you, or anyone else in this room, you are severely mistaken." The silence that followed her declaration was absolute. It was a suffocating, terrifying vacuum of sound. No one dared to breathe. Nia's hands shook violently at her sides, but they were hidden within the deep folds of her black silk gown. She had just openly confessed to being a thief to a man who routinely tortured people for stealing pennies. The boss stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. His dead eyes searched her face, looking for the lie, looking for the crack in her armor. But all he saw was the same terrifying fearlessness that had captivated his underboss just hours before. Suddenly, a harsh, grating laugh erupted from the boss's chest. He leaned back in his throne, clapping his hands together slowly, the sound echoing like gunshots in the quiet room. "Magnificent," the boss chuckled, though his eyes remained entirely devoid of warmth. "Absolutely magnificent. You are a fiery little thing, aren't you? I can see why my underboss was so thoroughly distracted. It is rare to find a woman who does not weep in my presence." He stopped clapping, and the atmosphere in the room instantly plummeted back to freezing. However, the boss continued, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating threat. "A thief is still a thief. And while Taejin might be amused by your audacity, I am a man of business. If you came to steal from us, then you took something. A silver briefcase, perhaps? One containing a very specific, highly classified ledger." Nia's blood ran completely cold. He knew. The package mix-up at the hotel hadn't gone unnoticed. He already knew she was the courier, and he knew exactly what she was holding. Taejin stepped forward, smoothly positioning himself right beside Nia, his broad shoulder pressing firmly against hers in a unified front. "The briefcase is secure," Taejin stated coldly. "Is it?" the boss asked, rising slowly from his velvet throne. The guards around him immediately mirrored his aggressive posture. "Because my sources tell me that a civilian courier walked out of the Grand Plaza with my financial network, and instead of executing her and recovering my property, you brought her to your penthouse and dressed her in diamonds. I want the ledger, Taejin. Right now. Hand it over, and I might just let your new bride live to see her wedding night." Taejin didn't hesitate. He didn't bargain. He looked his boss dead in the eye, the final remnants of his loyalty shattering completely. "No," Taejin said, his voice echoing with absolute, world-ending finality. The boss froze. "Excuse me?" "The ledger is no longer yours," Taejin declared, his hand finally reaching inside his tailored jacket, resting firmly on the grip of his weapon. "It is her dowry. And as of tonight, this syndicate no longer answers to you." Chaos erupted. The boss roared in absolute fury, signaling his guards to open fire, but Taejin had already anticipated the move. Before the boss's men could even unholster their weapons, the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom violently burst open. "Get down!" Taejin roared, grabbing Nia by the waist and violently pulling her to the marble floor just as the deafening sound of automatic gunfire shattered the crystal chandeliers above them. The deafening sound of automatic gunfire completely drowned out the collective screams of the underworld elite as thousands of shards of crystal rained down from the shattered chandeliers. Taejin's heavy, muscular frame was a human shield over Nia, pressing her firmly into the cold marble floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands instinctively flying over her ears to block out the apocalyptic roar of the ballroom turning into a war zone. The beautiful black silk gown that had made her feel like a queen just moments ago was now soaked in the freezing water from overturned ice buckets and the warm, terrifying spray of someone else's blood. "Do not look up, Nia." Taejin roared over the cacophony of violence, his voice an anchor in the absolute chaos. He didn't cower. Even lying on the floor, surrounded by a hail of bullets, the notoriously psychotic and lethal underboss of the city's largest mafia remained terrifyingly composed. With one arm wrapped protectively around her waist, locking her to his side, his free hand unholstered a heavy, matte black handgun from his tailored jacket. He fired 3 consecutive shots without even seemingly taking the time to aim. A heavy thud sounded just feet away as one of the boss's loyalists collapsed. Nia couldn't stop her entire body from violently shaking. She was a high-end courier who had been drowning in her father's gambling debt just 24 hours ago. Now, she was caught in the exact epicenter of a catastrophic Mafia war, wearing a massive, flawless diamond ring that marked her as the catalyst for a bloody coup. "Move," Taejin commanded, his grip on her waist tightening as he violently pulled her up from the marble floor. He dragged her behind a massive, overturned banquet table that splintered under the heavy barrage of incoming fire. Nia gasped for air, her lungs burning with the thick, suffocating stench of spent gunpowder and copper. She looked at Taejin. His bespoke midnight blue tuxedo was ruined, dusted with drywall and debris, but his pitch-black eyes were completely consumed by a dark, ravenous brilliance. This was his element. The polite, stoic mask of the underworld strategist was gone, replaced entirely by the bloodthirsty monster who had orchestrated this entire mutiny just to keep her safe. "You're bleeding," Nia choked out, her trembling fingers reaching out to touch a deep graze on his sharp jawline. Taejin didn't even flinch at the pain. He caught her hand, pressing his lips fiercely against the heavy platinum band on her ring finger. "It is not my blood, my love. Stay completely still." Across the cavernous, opulent ballroom, the old boss was roaring in absolute fury. The older, terrifyingly calm man who had been sipping whiskey on his velvet throne was now scrambling backward as his defensive line crumbled. Taejin's men, the dozen enforcers in immaculate black suits who had flooded into the penthouse earlier, were executing a perfectly coordinated massacre. They were merciless, sweeping through the room and eliminating anyone who dared to point a weapon at the new king and his bride. "Kill him," the boss shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation as he realized his empire was collapsing in real time. 50 million won to the man who brings me Taejin's head and the courier's ledger. The mention of the decrypted ledger, the financial lifeblood of South Korea's most lethal underworld syndicate that Nia had accidentally stolen, sent a renewed wave of desperate greed through the surviving loyalists. 3 heavily armed men flanked the overturned table where Taejin and Nia were hiding. Nia screamed as the heavy oak table splintered inches from her face. But before the gunmen could adjust their aim, Taejin rose with terrifying, lethal grace. He didn't just shoot, he moved like a shadow, disarming the first man, using his body as a shield against the second, and firing a single, devastating shot into the third. It was a brutal, flawless display of violence that left Nia completely paralyzed. He was a murderer. He was a monster. And yet, as he looked back at her, ensuring no debris had touched her skin, she realized with a dark, terrifying certainty that she would follow him into the fires of hell. The ballroom was growing quieter. The deafening roar of automatic weapons was replaced by the agonizing groans of the dying and the sharp, methodical executions being carried out by Taejin's lead enforcer, the man with the jagged scar across his throat. "The perimeter is entirely ours, sir," the enforcer shouted across the smoke-filled room, his suit painted in blood. "The boss is making a run for the private elevator in the West Wing." Taejin dropped his empty magazine and slammed a fresh one into his weapon with a sharp, metallic click. He looked down at Nia, offering her his hand. The contrast of his rough, calloused palms against her soft skin sent a confusing, fiery shiver coursing through her veins, just as it had in the penthouse. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly vibration that belonged only to her. Nia nodded, her breath hitching as she took his hand. He pulled her up, instantly tucking her securely against his solid chest. She clung to his lapels, the heavy diamond veil still pinned to her dark curls, miraculously intact despite the destruction around them. "Do not let go of me," Taejin commanded softly. They stepped out from behind the barricade, walking through the absolute carnage of the Grand Hyatt Ballroom. The hundreds of the most dangerous, bloodthirsty criminals in Asia who had been seated at the round tables just minutes ago were either dead or kneeling on the marble floor, their hands raised in absolute surrender to the new boss. Taejin didn't spare them a single glance. He kept Nia firmly tucked against his side, moving with a slow, predatory arrogance toward the West Wing. They pushed through the heavy wooden doors leading to the private corridors. The boss was frantically hitting the call button for the private elevator, his immaculately pressed suit ruined, his two remaining guards bleeding profusely beside him. When he heard the doors open, he spun around, his hollow, dead eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as he saw Taejin walking toward him with the black woman in the silk gown. Taejin, the boss gasped, raising his hands in a pathetic attempt to placate the monster he had created. You are making a catastrophic mistake. The White Tigers are mobilizing in the lower districts. If you fracture this syndicate now, they will slaughter us all. This syndicate is not fractured, Taejin replied seamlessly, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He raised his weapon, the barrel pointing directly at the older man's chest. It is simply under new management. The boss's eyes darted frantically to Nia, his cruel smile returning for a brief, desperate second as he tried to find a vulnerability. You are throwing away an empire for a civilian? A thief? When she realizes the true depth of the blood on your hands, she will run from you. You will die completely alone, boy. Nia's hands shook violently at her sides, but she stepped out from behind his massive, protective frame, lifting her chin and locking eyes directly with the man who had threatened to torture her father. The fear that had paralyzed her for the last several hours suddenly evaporated, replaced by the same terrifying fire she had shown in the nightclub. He isn't throwing away an empire, Nia said, her voice ringing out clear and steady in the silent, blood-soaked corridor. He is building a new one. And I am never running away. Taejin stared at her, his pitch-black eyes completely consumed by a dark, ravenous pride. The last remnants of his loyalty to the old regime shattered completely. Without another word, without a single moment of hesitation or bargaining, Taejin pulled the trigger. The deafening crack echoed through the hallway. The boss collapsed against the elevator doors, his reign of terror officially over. Taejin slowly lowered his weapon. He didn't look at the body. He only looked at Nia. The heavy, suffocating chains of the criminal underworld that she thought would drag her down had instead become her absolute armor. The psychotic underboss had burned down his entire world to protect her, and standing in the ashes of the old syndicate, he dropped to his knees. He wasn't defeated. He was completely, utterly devoted. He took her trembling left hand, his thumb gently smoothing over her knuckles as he pressed a fiercely possessive kiss to the flawless diamond ring. The ledger is secure. The throne is ours, Taejin whispered, his voice shaking with a reverence so deep it felt like a prayer. He looked up at her, crowning her the undisputed queen of his new empire. No one will ever hunt you again, my wife. I swear it on my life. The remaining enforcers flooded into the hallway behind them, stopping dead in their tracks at the sight of the old boss lifeless on the floor and the new boss kneeling before his bride. The lead enforcer with the jagged scar immediately dropped to one knee, bowing his head in perfect, terrifying unison with the rest of the heavily armed mercenaries. Boss. Madam, they chanted loudly, the sound echoing like thunder, cementing the transfer of absolute power. Taejin stood up smoothly, pulling Nia flush against his solid chest. He gently cupped her tear-stained face with infinite, desperate tenderness, completely ignoring the army of killers waiting for his command. Get the cars ready, Taejin ordered over his shoulder, his eyes never leaving hers. We are going home. As they walked back through the ruined ballroom, stepping over the remnants of the past, Nia realized she was no longer the terrified courier running from shadows. She was the untouchable Mafia bride, bound to a man who would gladly burn down the world just to keep her warm. And as the heavy golden doors closed behind them, shutting out the carnage, she finally felt something she hadn't felt since the day she stole the wrong briefcase. She felt safe. The adrenaline that had sustained Nia through the bloody massacre in the ballroom finally shattered the moment the heavy, armored doors of the Maybach clicked shut, sealing them in the quiet, climate-controlled cabin. The chaotic symphony of police sirens, torrential rain, and the shouts of the Mafia's cleanup crew faded into a distant, muffled hum. Nia collapsed back against the plush leather seat, her entire body trembling so violently her teeth chattered. The flawless black silk gown was ruined, stiff with drying blood and soaked from the storm. She stared blankly at her trembling hands, her eyes locked on the massive platinum diamond ring glittering on her left finger. It wasn't a symbol of rescue. It was a shackle. A fake marriage forged in blood, designed as a temporary shield to survive the night. But now the boss was dead. A large, warm hand reached across the spacious cabin, attempting to gently pull her close. Nia violently flinched, pressing her spine completely flat against the opposite door. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice shaking with a potent mix of terror and absolute disgust. Taejin paused. He didn't look offended. Instead, a dark, chillingly possessive smirk played on his lips. He leaned back against the leather, his ruined, midnight blue tuxedo jacket dusted with drywall and stained with blood. "You are my wife, Nia," Taejin murmured, his voice a low, soothing vibration that only made her stomach churn. "Get used to my touch." "It's a fake marriage," Nia cried out, her chest heaving as she glared at the monster sitting across from her. "It was a cover. You told me it was the only way to stop your boss from killing me over that damn ledger. But you just murdered him, Taejin. You slaughtered everyone in that room. The cover isn't necessary anymore. Take this ring off and let me go." Taejin's pitch-black eyes darkened, the polite, stoic mask of the underboss completely vanishing, replaced by a man consumed by an unhinged obsession. "The boss is dead," Taejin agreed seamlessly, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just assassinated his own mentor. "The cover is no longer necessary. But the marriage remains. I claimed you in that penthouse, Nia. Did you honestly believe I would let you walk away?" Nia's blood ran cold. She was entirely trapped. She had walked into a luxury hotel as a drowning courier desperate to pay off her father's gambling debts. Now, she was a prisoner in a golden cage, locked in a moving vehicle with a psychotic killer who had just burned down his entire criminal empire solely to possess her. The motorcade bypassed the city entirely, climbing high into the forested mountains overlooking Seoul. They pulled into a sprawling, breathtaking modern fortress of dark wood, black marble, and floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass. It was surrounded by an army of heavily armed guards patrolling the high stone walls. As Taejin forced her out of the car and guided her through the massive mahogany double doors, dozens of the estate's staff, dressed in impeccable uniforms, bowed deeply at the waist. "Welcome home, boss." "Welcome home, madam," they chanted in perfect, terrifying unison. Nia felt physically sick. Madam. The title felt like a death sentence. Taejin ignored the staff, leading her up a floating glass staircase and into the master suite, a cavernous, opulent space warmed by a massive stone fireplace. Once the heavy bedroom door clicked shut, the harsh, bright lights of the attached spa-like bathroom illuminated a dark, spreading stain on the side of Taejin's white dress shirt. He was bleeding. Taejin unbuttoned the ruined fabric with mild, complete indifference, letting it drop to the floor to reveal a heavily scarred, muscular torso built for violence. A jagged bullet graze ran deep along his ribs. Nia despised him. She wanted to turn her back, walk out of the room, and let him bleed. He was a murderer who had forced her into this nightmare against her will. But as she looked at the fresh blood dripping onto the pristine marble floor, blood he had shed taking a bullet meant for her during the ballroom shootout, her conscience viciously betrayed her. She owed him her life, even if he was the one who had ruined it. "Sit down," Nia ordered, her voice trembling with anger, not affection. Taejin's eyebrows rose fractionally, amused by her fiery defiance, but he complied, sitting on the edge of the sunken marble bathtub. Nia grabbed a first aid kit from the mirrored cabinets, soaking a white towel in antiseptic. She refused to look him in the eye. She kept her gaze strictly on his ribs, her movements jerky and tense. As she pressed the alcohol-soaked towel against the open wound, Taejin hissed sharply. His massive hand instinctively shot out, gripping her waist to steady himself against the blinding sting. The sudden, forceful pull threw Nia entirely off balance. She gasped as she stumbled forward, her hands flying out and flattening directly against his bare, scarred chest to catch herself. For a split second, time completely froze. She was trapped between his parted knees, the heat of his skin searing through her palms. She could feel the frantic, powerful beating of his heart beneath her fingertips. Taejin looked down at her, his breathing turning ragged. The proximity was suffocating. His dark eyes glazed over with a starving, desperate lust. He reached up, his large, calloused hand sliding to the back of her neck, pulling her in to claim her lips. A violent wave of revulsion crashed over Nia. "No," she choked out. Nia violently shoved herself backward, tearing herself out of his grip. She scrambled away until her back hit the cold marble wall of the bathroom, her chest heaving as she looked at him with sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked at her hands, imagining they were stained with the same blood that coated his. "I despise you," Nia breathed, wrapping her arms around herself defensively, her eyes welling with furious tears. "You killed dozens of men tonight. You hijacked my entire life. I don't care what you did to protect me, I am not your wife. How am I supposed to escape this nightmare?" Taejin didn't flinch at her hatred. He simply picked up the discarded towel and wiped the blood from his own ribs. He stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a massive, terrifying shadow over her. He stalked across the bathroom, stopping inches from her, trapping her against the wall. He slammed one hand flat against the marble beside her head, leaning down until his lips hovered beside her ear. "You don't escape, Nia," Taejin whispered, his voice a dark, vibrating threat that offered absolutely no mercy. "You think this was a temporary arrangement? I assassinated the reigning king of the underworld for you. I don't care if you despise me. I don't care if you spend the rest of your life trying to run. You belong to me. My ring is on your finger, and you will stay in this fortress until you learn to accept it."